这个就是热恋。
哪小了呀？
热恋订婚是一个。
我觉得不小啊。
左右手
热恋订婚
小，
一般在左手。
但是左撇子是不是在右手？
But where's the one?
小。
这个外面去 toilet。
Toilet?
他那个邮件是发这个发的这个多小啊？啊？
微宝。少女。
哇，这个画面太可爱了！
还要用这个。
我没事，我带了。
这画面太美了，太可爱了！
那你呢？上次有没有说可以说男人小，可以说男人
我要剃吧。
剃了吧？你当然不剃啥呀？
你不知道听说群众的观点吗？目前全中国都让
剃了吧？
对，要签到，没签。
再剃一下。我觉得他们是非常有主见的，你们的想法根本不重要。
我想的是我带着剃须刀去照一张剃的照
Last one. 你的。
现在大家这个有两种感觉，有人觉得不错，
那小孩死了。
No, I don't mind. Yeah, that's what everybody says yes. Lakshmi.
我没有白纸了，我也没有。借我一下，回头还你去打。关键我没有，我自己有的。你干嘛吃的？真没你就听吧，他说这节课不用进行。我有一首诗。
知道了。
Check your WhatsApp. Okay, no problem. Okay?
My phone not work.
？All right, 1600 sharp. It's me today. Johannes sends his regards. He couldn't make it, but as I said, we will take it in turns. She's still getting the remainder of the presentation, but I usually start with a short repetition of what we did on Tuesday anyway. And I'll skip through a few things which I think you don't need to necessarily remember to get the full picture, which are obviously helpful, but which you don't really need to know. But I'll stress those which I find very important for you to know, and therefore you can also judge what the main topics are. We have talked about the general principles. We've differentiated between the strategic and the financial investors, and as I said last Tuesday, we will focus on the financial investor model, which is the leverage type acquisition model. And with that in mind, we will continue to think about where do the funds come from, where do the funds go to, and how is it structured. And the question, where do the funds come from, in relation to financial investors was answered it's going to be equity, whether in the form of real equity or shareholder loans, different question, but equity. And then funding from third-party lenders, and that could be in the form of bank lenders, and could also be in the form of debt capital markets issuances, so bonds subscribed to by debt investors. Where do the funds go to? The funds in a leverage type acquisition always go to three uses. So we differentiate between sources, equity and debt, and uses. And the uses are purchase price for the target company or the target group, so purchase price for the shares, transaction costs, and refinancing of target or target group financial indebtedness. Why refinancing? Why can't the financing stay in place? Remember, there's a change of control contained in nearly all financing agreements, primarily due to regulatory reasons, but also for internal risk reasons of the bank. And typically, when shares change hands, the change of control clause is triggered and the banks expect to be refinanced. Therefore, whoever purchases a company that has existing debt on its balance sheet will need to have funds in place to also refinance the existing indebtedness. And then again, in the differentiation between strategic and non-strategic strategic and financial investors, you've learned last Tuesday that financial investors normally seek a non-recourse financing, and what we haven't really talked about in detail is, except for the leveraged principle or the leveraged model, why do financial investors do that? I mean, we've seen that using debt is accretive to the return on equity investment, as long as the interest rate that is paid for the debt is lower than the internal rate of return. But what do the financial investors do with the rest? Do you know? I mean, first of all, they use debt financing because their own loss is smaller if they only invest a smaller portion. Remember, we said on Tuesday, the equity is always the first loss piece, but obviously if the loss is higher than the first loss piece, the initial equity, it eats into the debt. And if the financial investor would use everything, including the debt portion, to be financed by equity, it would eat up more of its equity. So, by using leverage in an acquisition, the financial investor is able to A, obtain a higher return on equity through the leverage principle, B, is able to reduce its first loss piece, it invests less equity, and therefore its potential loss is smaller, even though the transaction doesn't have to be smaller. And 3, by investing less equity in the individual transaction, the financial investor is able to do more transactions and thereby to spread its risk across different investments, right? If I put all my funds into one deal, it's obviously riskier than to use a portfolio approach and invest in 10 different companies, of which, one may end belly up insolvent, but 9 may perform well. And therefore, using leverage on an acquisition also helps to diversify the investments which a financial investor does. Is that clear? So basically 3 reasons: increase your return on equity, reduce your first loss piece, and C, enable the investor to spread its risk by diversifying in different investments. Okay. We've briefly looked at the charts, simplified graphs, showing the different types of acquisition structures. And this, as I said, the leveraged model is what we will be looking at throughout the course. Again, you can see the three, well, kind of, not really, at least two of the uses of the funds, which is the payment of the purchase price of the seller, and obviously transaction cost always goes hand in hand with that. And then we have the acquisition debt as one of the sources, but it usually also repays existing target indebtedness. This was the slightly more complicated and more complete chart showing We'll interrupt just for a second to switch to the full presentation. Yeah. Merci. Just the more complete chart with at least two different or three different types of lenders: the senior lenders, the mezzanine lenders, and a seller who might provide a vendor loan, plus, if you want to count the shareholder loans from the sponsor and from the management, two more sources of debt basically in the structure. Now, what we haven't talked about on Tuesday, but I wanted to briefly touch upon, are the different types of loans mentioned here. We're talking about an acquisition loan, we're talking about working capital refinancing for the target company, and the working capital refinancing for the subsidiaries. I mean, they seem to come, at least here, all from one and the same group of lenders, the senior lenders. Do you know, I mean, we've briefly touched upon the point, do you know why the working capital would be provided towards the target company and the subsidiaries? Why isn't the working capital facility provided to the acquisition company? It's two reasons. One is very simple.
Target company and subsidiary need that to work, need that to operate. Right.
Exactly, and what about Aquico? It has no operations, right?
No, Aquico is just a special vehicle that's used to acquire those companies.
Exactly, and it doesn't have any working capital needs.
Yes.
It doesn't have operations, it doesn't have to buy supplies, and so on. That's why the working capital doesn't go to the acquisition company. Well, in fact, it very often does, at least initially. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that the senior lenders want to provide the working capital to the target company and the subsidiaries. Why? Does anybody have an idea?
Because the purpose that the senior lender want to lend money to is to acquisition the target company. He want to make sure that target companies will work very well, and then he can more easily get back her money.
That is in part correct. It goes, I mean, the reason, or the purpose I'm asking has to do with what we talked about at the end of our last course, and that's structural subordination. We said that the bank lenders want to be as close to the assets as possible, right? They want to lend to an entity that has assets, that has cash flows, and the reason was, does anybody remember?
Because they will not have claim against the parent company. They will always have because parent company is the equity holder of subsidiaries. So they want to have a direct claim on subsidiaries asset, because if they have a claim on the parent company, then they only have a equity holding.
They only have a claim
against the equity, which will not come.
If an insolvency occurs, there will not be any residual value for the equity, and the lenders won't have access to any source of, and that's cash flows and assets, right? Remember, that's something I said on Tuesday, which is very important to remember. in the leveraged model, the banks are lending on a non-recourse basis, and non-recourse meant only against the cash flows and the assets of the target company. That's the sole source of any kind of repayment. And that's why the senior lenders want to lend to the target company. They don't want to lend to the Acrico. Well, initially they have to lend to Acrico because Acrico still needs to purchase the target company, and in order to purchase, it needs funds, and it will have to have these funds from the lenders. So the lenders will effectively, basically split the loans, at least ultimately. They will split the loans in an acquisition loan to the acquisition company, which is basically payment of the purchase price and transaction costs, and refinancing of existing debt at the target company level, because they can actually, or could in theory, refinance that directly to the target company. Now things get a little bit more difficult now, because the reality looks a bit different. This is the target picture, but it doesn't work like that technically. And the reason for that is when Acrico acquires the target company, what happens? Well, Acrico will purchase the shares for a purchase price. The closing requires a purchase price to be paid. Acrico needs funds for that. At the same time, when the change of control in the shares occurs, Target's existing debt will become repayable due to the change of control. Does it have to become repayable immediately? Well, technically it doesn't, but in practice it nearly always does. And the reason for that is, if you disregard the situation, the target situation for a second, how does the structure look? How does the structure look before our acquisition company becomes the shareholder of the target company? Well, there's another shareholder, right? And that's the seller. The seller, instead of Acrico, holds shares in the target company. And guess what? What will the seller have done in the past? It will have financed its purchase price of the target company. If the seller is another private equity fund, as very often companies are handed over from private equity fund to private equity fund, then the target group will have granted security, the target group may have acceded to the seller's financing because they also want a working capital facility for the target company and its subsidiary. And that means prior to closing, the banks have their hands on the target company and they have security. And now, if Acrico wants to buy the target company, what will they say? I'm only going to pay the purchase price if, what happens? I get the shares without?
Encumbrances. No.
Without encumbrances, exactly. And not only the shares, they also don't want the target company's assets to be pledged or transferred as security. So, what has to happen in practice is, at closing, all the existing encumbrances over the target group need to be released. And how do I achieve that? Well, I need to find an agreement with the existing banks, that the existing banks release all their collateral. And when will they only do that?
When they get repaid.
When they get repaid, exactly. And now it all comes together. What happens in practice is, if the seller wants to sell the target company and acquisition co wants to purchase the target company, the seller, together with the target group, needs to approach the existing target group's banks and needs to say, look, there will be a closing in which a change of control will occur. Can we please agree that if on a given day X the banks receive all outstanding claims under debt financing, banks release all your collateral. That's what we call a release and payoff agreement. A release and payoff agreement says if the banks receive an amount of X on day Y, they will release all collateral and will declare that they have received what they can demand to receive. And then what happens? Well, the purchaser, Agrico, will pay the equity purchase price, which is net of debt, to the seller, and it will make a payment to the senior lenders of the existing target company financing directly at closing. Because they know if a certain amount of money hits the account of the senior lenders, all security will be released and they will be getting what they want to have, unencumbered shares and unencumbered assets. So that's why while in theory the senior lenders would prefer to lend to the target company initially, but have to lend in a first step to Agrico, even in order to repay existing target company debt and existing target company working capital financing. Now, we'll get to that in the course of today. What I'm going to mention to you is that in the amount in which Agrico has repaid target company debt, target company will be in a position to assume a part of the financing which Agrico has received from its new banks. That's what we call a debt pushdown. Because it's debt taken out by Agrico from its new banks, but which is pushed down subsequently to the level of the target company. And then the new banks have what they wanted. They get as close to the assets as they can because they wanted to finance at least the refinancing directly to the target company, but they couldn't do that because Agrico in the first step had to make sure that all the funds were used to pay the purchase price for the shares and to refinance the old banks directly. Questions?
I want to make sure that is it the Agrico or the target company to pay for the existing banks to release their pledge?
It's a good question. In reality, the payment will be made by Agrico, but it will be a payment on behalf of the target company for the account of the target company. So Agrico will be paying target company's debt to target company's old lenders. Technically, this gives, and if Agrico does that, that gives Agrico a claim against the target company in the same amount. Because Agrico has done something on behalf of target company and has relieved target company of target company debt. And therefore Agrico has a claim in the same amount against target company. And this claim is used to transport that portion of the acquisition loan which Agrico has taken out in order to repay on behalf of target company. So in two steps, you achieve the result that you would have achieved had Agrico asked its new lenders to make a loan to target company for target company to be able to repay its old banks. But that's not the way Agrico would like that to be, because as long as it doesn't have its hands on the shares, it can't ensure it will receive anything back. It won't be asking its new banks to make a payment to the target company as long as target company is not yet its own subsidiary. So we'll get to that. It's what we call the subsequent target company assumes Agrico debt in the amount which target company was relieved of old financing, that's what we call a debt pushdown. And debt pushdown is one means of overcoming the phenomenon which we call structural subordination. Again, remember, banks want to be as close to the assets as they can for the reason that we've discussed on Tuesday, and which I'll repeat in a second. We've talked about the leveraged model and how the use of debt increases the return on equity. We've talked about the different ways of providing equity via real equity or shareholder loans. We've discussed that if the banks permit equity to be provided as shareholder loans, that shareholder loans need to be subordinated in order to count as equity and to be acceptable to the banks. We've talked about bank debt, or debt generally, which can come in the form of lender bank debt, or in the form of capital markets indebtedness, and ultimately also in the form of a vendor loan. You've seen that, and we've discussed that at least in most jurisdictions, the different types of lenders rank on equal foots, so are pari passu ranked. And if we want to change that order, we can only do that by two ways. One is a contractual arrangement between the different lenders, and the other one is a factual step, and that's by taking security. We've briefly touched upon the equitable subordination, which can make a debt lender an equity holder from an insolvency law or from a ranking perspective, but I don't want to stress that once again. For me, it was important that you understand that everything starts with the way the debt and the equity are ranked from a statutory standpoint. And I think it's a universal concept in nearly all, if not all, jurisdictions, that equity comes last, while debt is always in front of the equity. Over here in Germany, all debt, and not only bank debt, but all creditors, rank pari passu in insolvency. There's only a few exceptions which you don't need to remember. In certain circumstances, the state can rank behind a craftsman, for example, if the claim which the state has is a fine. So, if the company has done something illegal and is fined, a fine would rank behind normal debt in an insolvency. But these are fine lines which you don't need to remember. Again, we've talked about the ability to change the statutory order by way of contract and by way of security. And we'll get to that in much more detail later on. This was important. Structural subordination. And before we look at this picture once again, can someone, and I'm just flipping back to the old chart because I don't want you to look at that, when you explain to me what structural subordination means. In very simple words. Yes?
Maybe a structure like a rank. And the subordination maybe is just the rank of the debt. Someone can first and someone can. How to design it, this structure.
And what does that have to do with structure? That was the question?
Because if you don't have a whole structure, you cannot define.
Too complicated. Simpler. Much simpler. Much simpler. Two entity levels, E1 and E2. E1 is the shareholder in E2. E1 has creditors and E2 has creditors. What does structural subordination mean and why?
In this case, the creditors of E1 will have no claim against E2 in case E2 goes insolvent. because the creditors of E2 will have the first claim. Since E1 is the equity holder in E2, the creditors of E1 will only have claim against that equity, which ultimately would be nothing. So that's such subordination.
It was nearly perfect, and the only technical correction I would like to make is the creditors of E1 rank structurally junior or are structurally subordinated to the creditors of E2. And the reason is that the creditors of E1, assuming that E1 is a holding company, will never have access to the value that's hidden in E2 or E2 group in case E2 goes insolvent, because as you've said, in an insolvency of E2, the insolvency administrator will distribute whatever is there in accordance with the statutory order of priorities. And the statutory order of priorities says, satisfy your creditors first. And only if there's anything left, your shareholder, the equity, will get a single penny. And only if the shareholder gets a single penny can the shareholder use this penny to repay its creditors. So, unless the creditors have a direct claim against E2, structural subordination means they will depend on there being any insolvency surplus, surplus meaning an excess of value of the claims of all other creditors. That's structural subordination. And in our picture, remember that I've just described how the loan to Aquico is granted initially. And remember also that I've said the banks will only ever be able to recover their financing through the assets and the cash flows of the target group. That means, just assume for a second we only have senior lenders, yeah? If the senior lenders provide the loan to Aquico, and Aquico uses it to pay the purchase price, to repay the target company debt, and to pay transaction costs, well, the senior lenders will be structurally subordinated to all creditors of the target company, meaning to every single source of their own repayment. Because Aquico initially had equity, right? A third, as Johannes has put it. But they've used that equity to purchase the target company. So there's nothing left except for the shares in the target company. And that means our senior lenders need to do something. Otherwise they are structurally subordinated and they will only get a single penny ever if something goes wrong with the target group, if there's a liquidation surplus. And remember, given that this is the only source of repayment, that's hardly acceptable to the lender. So our bank will start to think about ways of overcoming this structural subordination. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Anybody else? Is that clear so far? Now, we've said our banks want to be there where the cash flows and the assets are, because this is the source of their repayment. How on earth can they get access, and I mean untechnical access, to the target company's cash flows and assets? Has anybody got any idea?
As you said before, they transfer the debt from the parent Aquico to the target company. So it's like a
Debt push down was the term, correct. A debt push down. That's a very good answer. Now, do you think you can do that in an unlimited amount? Can target companies simply take on parent debt to the full amount?
For, I think it can be like a specifics of the insider trading, so self-dealing. So it's like
Doesn't have to do with self-dealing. Let's just note down ways of overcoming for a second, and I'll get to your the debt pushdown is the most important. Well, actually, it's not, but it's one way of overcoming. It's one way of overcoming structural indebtedness. Think about different ways of how can the senior lenders become creditors of the target company or the subsidiaries. I have a very smart idea. Yeah?
Can you assign it?
Pardon?
Can you assign the loan?
That's the debt pushdown. Assigning the loan meaning the target company will assume the loan as the new debtor in place of Aquico. Well, that works, that's the debt pushdown, but it doesn't work in a full amount. Let's use an example. For the, I'm going to do it this way. Let's say the senior lenders have provided 500 of loans. Of the 500, 250 went to the old banks. The shares have cost 200, and Aquico has paid 50 of costs, right? 500 of sources, let's assume we didn't have any equity in the game, otherwise we would have had a 300 loan, or the shares have cost 400 and we put in 200 of additional equity. This makes it simpler. If the senior lenders have provided 500 of loan, 200 were used for the payment of the purchase price, 50 were used for the payment of cost, and 250 were used to repay the old banks. In Germany, without any other circumstances, the target company would only be able to assume half of the 500 million loan by way of a debt pushdown. Why? Because Aquico has used 250 of the 500 to repay target company's debts towards the old bank. And in the amount of 200, Aquico would have a claim against the target company for payment. And instead of paying the 250 up to Aquico, target company can assume 250 of Aquico's debt. It's the same way as a cash circle, right? Just cashless. It's a cashless way of paying its debt towards Aquico. So that would mean target company would then have 250 of debt towards the new senior lenders, and Aquico would still owe 250, which makes sense because it has used the 200 for the payment for the shares and 50 for the payment of the costs. Or, to put it differently, had we had a simpler situation at closing where the 500 had not gone to Aquico in full, but only 250 had gone to Aquico, and the new lenders had provided 250 directly to the target company, and the target company had repaid its old banks directly, then the 250 would have been a loan to the target company initially, so no problem. That's the same situation in which we are now after Aquico has taken out the full loan, paid on behalf of the target company, and in order to discharge its own reimbursement claim, target company has assumed Aquico's debt in the amount of 250. That's what we call a debt pushdown. Is that, you seem to look a bit confused?
Yeah. Like if you can just go once more on that debt pushdown. Like.
The senior lenders provide 500 of loan to Aquico.
Yeah.
Aquico uses 250 to repay to the old banks. it doesn't provide the 250 to the target company as a loan, it just pays straight to the old banks. But that gives Acrico a claim against the target company in the amount of 250. Now, the target company doesn't have 250 of cash to pay back to Acrico, but what it can do, it can assume half of the loan from Acrico, obviously only with the senior lender's consent, but it can assume 250 and thereby get rid of its own obligation to pay 250 to Acrico. You don't understand?
Yeah,
Shall I do it again?
No, it's okay.
Is that?
Yeah.
The others as well? What Acrico could do. Well, the only alternative scenario would be that the target company, now that the target company is obliged to pay 250 to Acrico for repaying the old banks, the only thing that could happen is the target company takes a new loan from the new lenders in the amount of 250, uses the cash it receives from the senior lenders to pay to Acrico the 250 which it owes to Acrico, and Acrico uses those 250 to repay its own 500 in the amount of 250. That would also result in Acrico owing the banks 250 and target company owing the banks 250. Is that clear?
Yeah.
We're just not doing that with cash. Instead, the banks allow Acrico to split the loan into two, and one portion in the amount of 250 is pushed down to the target company. A push down means Acrico is released from its obligation towards the banks, and target company assumes that in place of Acrico. So that's what we call a debt push down. We will repeat it next week, maybe with other words, and then it may become clearer. Another way of doing this is much simpler. What happens if target company and acquisition co are merged? Question? The balance sheets are combined,
yes,
right?
the target company become the debtor automatically.
Yes. It means that the balance sheets of those two entities are combined. The debt side is combined and the asset side is combined. Acrico and target company become one and the same, and Acrico no longer only has target shares. The target shares vanish; they are crossed out from the balance sheet, and instead the combined company will have all the assets on its balance sheet which target company previously had. On the debt side of things, the combined entity will have all trade creditors which were creditors of target company, and we would also have the senior lenders become creditors of the target company, and thereby, statutory order of priorities, the trade creditors and the lenders, all creditors, rank pari passu. Structural subordination gone. That's the second way of doing it. It doesn't happen very often, mostly for tax reasons, and some also for reasons of capital maintenance rules, which, by the way, and I like to mention that just as a side note, I don't want to overcomplicate things. Capital maintenance rules are the reason why the target company cannot assume the full 500. You may have asked yourself, why would the debt pushdown only occur in the amount of 250 and not in the amount of 500? Well, if the target company would assume 500, it would not only be paying the 250 to Acrico, it would in essence also be distributing a dividend in the amount of 250, because it would be paying to Acrico something. The alternative scenario from assuming the full 500 is target company takes out a new loan from the senior lenders in the full amount of 500, And in the amount of 250, the target company would be honoring an existing obligation, which is the obligation from the repayment of the old banks. That's 250. But if it paid 250 in addition to Agrico, the next 250, how would it do that? Either by way of an upstream loan, or it's a distribution, a dividend. It has to be some form of distribution, because there's no other claim which Agrico has against the target company, which can be used to transport that payment.
Why it have to be in the form of dividend, but just I don't understand why it don't can just sign a contract that the target company assume that obligation for the benefit of the Agrico.
Because the balance sheet would have to would have to be evened out. If the target company assumes 500 as debt,
yeah.
It needs
also
to.
it's like a debt transfer to the target.
Well, it's a debt transfer to the target company,
Yeah.
but it assumes debt from its parent,
Yeah.
and it can only do that if something else is evening out the additional debt on the balance, right? If you have, let's do it this way. Target company's balance sheet. Are you familiar with our German form T balance sheet?
Yeah.
Have you seen that before?
Yeah.
Good. Assets, liabilities. Liabilities include equity. This is TC, target company. Target company currently has assets of 500. It has a small equity of 50 and 450 of liabilities. Trade creditors, normal debt, whatever. Okay? This is pre-debt pushdown. Now, what happens if all of a sudden target company assumes additional debt of 500? The liability side goes up by 500. How do we do that?
Only.
Where does the equity go?
The asset maybe cash, or
Say
the
again?
asset. If you want to balance then the asset maybe cash.
Where does that come from?
From the loan?
No, because there's no cash coming in. It's just an assumption of debt.
But the liability side you already have
250.
215 claim to.
Correct. Of the 450, 250 are a liability to the shareholder. And to the extent we assume the 500, this liability is gone. But this still means that there's an additional liability of 250, right?
Yeah.
And if I add 450 and 250, I get to 600, 700, disregarding the equity. These are liabilities of 700. And if I have liabilities of 700 and assets of 500, what does that mean?
You're insolvent.
I'm insolvent, exactly. I'm over-indebted. I'm over-indebted, and I basically have a negative equity. Right? 500 assets, 700 liabilities means a negative equity of 200. Can I do that? Can I assume 500 of a loan? No, because this would cross out my positive equity of 50, and that's what I mean by capital maintenance rules. Corporate law prohibits us, at least in Germany and in many other jurisdictions, from doing a transaction for the benefit of the shareholder, which basically wipes out all the equity and results in negative equity, because this threatens all other creditors. And that's why I said we can do the 250. This is just a liability swap. I'm swapping liability to the shareholder for a liability to the banks. That's fine. It doesn't change the equity at all. But as soon as I assume more debt, I'm endangering the equity. I'm not protecting my capital. Not protecting the capital that is required to cover the liabilities. And that's something which is prohibited under corporate law, which is why we cannot assume 500. We can only assume 250. Now, if the target company's balance sheet looks differently, there may be potential to assume a little bit more. But in a simplified situation with more or less clean balance sheets, you wouldn't have that. If there was a higher equity, if there was equity reserves which you could otherwise distribute to your shareholder, so retain profits. If the balance sheet was, we have a statutory capital of 50, and we have retained earnings of 250, and we have liabilities of, say, 500, of which 250 are, from the repayment, and we have 500, 700, 800, assets of 800, we're in a different situation. Because we have retained earnings, which a company could normally use to simply distribute to its shareholder. Instead of distributing the 250 to the shareholder in cash, the company could assume 250 of additional liability to the senior lenders. It would simply mean that the liabilities would go up from 500 to 750, and the 250 retained earnings would be replaced by additional liabilities. It's what we call a swap on the passive side of the balance sheet. That is okay, and in this scenario, the full 500 could be assumed. It's just, these occasions are very rare. You don't often buy a company with tons of retained earnings on the balance sheet. Is that clear? Roughly?
Can I call it self-dealing?
It's not self-dealing. Self-dealing is something completely different. Self-dealing is when a company contracts with itself, or in terms of self-dealings, when you have directors' dealings, when the management deals in shares of the company. Now this is capital maintenance. And capital maintenance means the protection of the statutory capital, the minimum statutory capital, which have you ever seen an extract in one of the other courses from a commercial register for a German corporate entity? If you have a German limited liability company or a German stock corporation, they have a statutory minimum capital. And that's openly communicated to anyone out there in the world. You can look that up in the commercial register, and it basically tells you what capital must remain untouched. It's the cushion, it's the risk cushion for all creditors, basically. Because it's the number by which the assets must always exceed the liabilities. That's what we mean by statutory minimum capital, statutory equity. And the minimum capital a German limited liability company must have up just 25,000 euros. It's not much.
But then it doesn't really help though.
It doesn't really help. But that means if I'm contracting with a German GmbH that has the minimum statutory capital that's prescribed by law, I know that I don't have a strong counterparty. If, however, I'm contracting with a limited liability company that has a statutory capital of 20 million, I have a stronger counterparty. And there are companies out there which have a statutory minimum capital of a couple of billion.
Oh.
So, and these would be strong counterparties. But as a creditor, I can look up the commercial register and see what party I'm dealing with. And if I see a minimum capital of 25,000 euros, I may have to take other protective measures if I'm, relying on the creditworthiness of that entity. But the reason why we can't assume debt in an unlimited amount is the capital maintenance rules. And the capital maintenance rules are rules set to the management of the company, and the management mustn't enter into transactions which lead to the statutory capital being eaten up. So, that was our debt pushdown. The merger we've discussed. Can you think of anything else? For the working capital, to the extent it isn't needed to refinance existing working capital debt, the senior lenders could provide working capital loans directly to the target company and or the target company's subsidiaries. Those facilities would obviously only be provided post-closing. Yeah? But pre-closing, Apico doesn't normally need a working capital facility. So the target company could accede to the existing facility agreement, the loan agreement between the senior lenders and Apico, and be given an additional working capital facility post-closing. That way, the senior lenders would, at least in the amount of the working capital facility, be creditors of the target company directly. Can anybody think of anything else? Ways to overcome structural subordination, ways to overcome the order of priorities. One way is overcoming by contract, one way is overcoming by security.
Be a guarantor.
Very good. Very good. The senior lenders could ask the target company to guarantee Apico's loan. And what else? The senior lenders could also ask the target company and the subsidiaries to provide collateral. What happens if the target company provides a loan, a guarantee for the loan of the acquisition company? What happens in terms of order of priorities? Let's stick to our example. 500 loan by the senior lenders to Apico. Target company is asked to guarantee in the amount of 500. What does that mean? If the guarantee claim materializes, the senior lenders become creditors of the target company. And in insolvency of the target company, what happens? The senior lenders rank pari passu with the target company's other creditors. Well, great, that's what we wanted to do, right? It's that simple.
That enough? What do we want? I'm always thinking that.
You're right in thinking, is that enough?
Yeah.
No, it's not enough. We want to be ahead of the trade creditors, don't we?
Yeah.
Because we rely entirely on the cash flows of the target company and the target company's assets. So guaranteeing just gets us on even footing with all other creditors. What else can I do?
Collateral.
Exactly, because by taking collateral, I'm changing the order and I'm getting ahead of all others, right? So, very smart. The only thing you have to do is ask the target company to provide guarantees for Apico's obligations under the loan and to provide collateral. Hey, done. That was it. Not quite. Not quite. Why not?
only subsidiary provides collateral, but only subsidiary provides collateral. But I think the target company should also provide some collateral or assets.
The target company should provide collateral. The subsidiaries should provide collateral in relation to the assets. You know, the banks will want the target company and all subsidiaries to provide everything which they have. Yeah? Give mortgages over land, you know, give pledges over shares, give assignments of receivables, give pledges of bank accounts, and that's all great. Except that target company and subsidiaries can normally not do that in an unlimited amount. And why is that? There was something which we've mentioned before, and that's called capital limits. Right? Because pledging your assets and giving guarantees, if these guarantees and the pledges materialize, is nothing else but distributing to your shareholder. Because you're guaranteeing and securing shareholder obligations. So it's like giving the assets to the shareholder who would then repay the banks. Still, that's the way it's done. That's the way it's done in normal acquisition financings. Post-closing, the most important target companies and the most important target company subsidiaries are asked to guarantee the bank facilities, the acquisition facilities, and they are asked to collateralize those to the extent they are not assumed by the target company by way of a debt push down. I mean, to the extent the debt is pushed down and can be pushed down, given that target debt was refinanced, they don't have to guarantee it will be their own obligations, and they can, of course, secure their own obligations. That's possible. But to the extent the target company and the subsidiaries guarantee Apico's obligations, they can only do that to the extent they don't breach capital maintenance rules. And the way this is done technically is target company and subsidiaries guarantee the loans and they provide collateral, but subject to what we call limitation language. Limitation language reduces the amount in which guarantees can be enforced, and they reduce the amount in which proceeds of collateral can be used to discharge Apico's obligations in order to safeguard the statutory equity. And the way limitation language is crafted, it looks at the target company's balance sheet in the moment in which the guarantee is called upon or the collateral is enforced. And you look how much would be available for distribution to the shareholder in that moment. And that amount is permitted to be given to the senior lenders. It's all simplified, but that's the way it basically works. You don't have to remember that. What I want you to remember is the 4 ways to overcome structural subordination. And the first one being, the simplest one being the merger. The second being the debt pushdown. Remember, not possible in an unlimited amount normally. The third one being provide working capital facility to the target company directly. And the fourth one, guaranteeing and collateralizing Apico's obligations to the bank. But remember, you cannot do that in an unlimited amount. Because we want to take the guarantees and we want to have collateral in place, we needed to discharge the old debt of the target company. Remember that I said earlier, there is this, what we call a payoff and release agreement, which is executed between the target company and its old banks. And Apico and Apico's banks have an interest in doing that. because they want to be sure that all collateral, all existing collateral is discharged because they want to take that collateral for themselves in order to overcome structural subordination. I know this is rather complicated, tough stuff, but it's really something that I'd like you to remember. And we will discuss this once again, because this is really important. This is how acquisition financing is structured. And this is, it's all about ensuring that you can get guarantees and can get collateral. It's about ensuring that you can do a debt push down to the largest extent possible. So the banks, when you negotiate an acquisition facility, will ask, how much capacity is there to debt push down? And the capacity to debt push down depends on whether there are any retained earnings that I can use to transport the debt push down, right? Except for the repayment of the target indebtedness, which is always available to transport a debt push down. Yes?
I want to ask about the working capital loan, this method. If you use this method, this method is post-closing?
Yeah. Post-closing.
And but you as senior lenders always have claims against Acrico.
You will always have claims against Acrico also for a working capital facility that is provided to the target loan, because the banks will always ask Acrico to guarantee its subsidiaries' debt.
Yeah, but you cannot avoid if the target company is insolvent, your acquisition loan cannot be paid first.
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, yeah. My question is, senior lenders, they have two loans, acquisition loan against Acrico,
yeah,
and the working capital loan against the target company. Yeah. If you do the working capital loan and the target company is insolvent, the working capital loan is not subordinated.
It's not subordinated. No, it's
acquisition loan is all.
That's subordinated unless we have used one of the methods to overcome structural subordination. For example, by guaranteeing the acquisition loan, right? If the target company guarantees the senior lender's claim against Acrico, the senior lenders become creditors to the target company when Acrico can't pay.
Yeah, so it's got to push down and guarantee and you merger.
Three methods. The fourth method is provide debt to the target company directly, right? When we do this financing, obviously the combined group will at some point in time need working capital financing, yeah, to buy supplies, to make upfront payments to its employees if need be, right? The combined group post-closing will have to have some form of working capital financing. And now you could say, well, Acrico is already the borrower, so let Acrico take out the working capital facility and then provide the funds to the target company. But the banks will say, no. You can have a revolving facility, a working capital facility, but I don't want to provide that to Acrico. I want to provide that to the target company directly to be close to the assets. And that's how you do it. That's why that is the fourth method. Okay? Now that you understand what structural subordination means, once again, what does structural subordination mean?
Structural subordination means that the creditors of E1 will not have any claim against the assets of E2 in case of insolvency.
Means that the creditors of E1
will be structurally subordinated to the creditors of E2.
Exactly. And now, very often, when we do larger amount acquisition financings, on top of what you see here, you can have something different. We quite often structure in a way in which you already know our Acrico, you already know our target company, you already know the lenders that provide acquisition loan and a working capital facility to Acrico and the target company. But what you haven't seen so far is that Acrico may have a direct shareholder, which is also held by the funds, by the sponsor, and that holdco also takes out financing. For example, by way of a bond. Now, what would you say? How would the bondholders rank versus the lenders? What's their ranking?
Bad. Bad.
Bad. Well, you've used better terms to describe the situation just 10 seconds ago.
Structurally subordinated.
Exactly. They are structurally junior to the senior and mezzanine lenders because they lend at a level up in the chain. They're lending to E1, whereas our senior and mezzanine lenders are lending to E2, which is why the bondholders are structurally subordinated to the bank lenders. That's all. It's that simple. But that happens very often. What does that mean? What do you think? If these guys here get an interest rate of 5%, what do you think do the bondholders want? Less or more?
More.
Yes. This would be a so-called holdco bond. A holdco bond that is granted to a holding company of an operating group, where the holding company normally doesn't have any own business. And given that the bondholders of holdco are structurally subordinated to the creditors of the operating entities, holdco, will have to pay a higher coupon. Johannes, who was here on Tuesday, has just closed today a financing for the holdco of the Schaeffler Group. Schaeffler Group is an automotive supplier, a large German automotive supplier who also owns a large share in Continental, the other automotive supplier. And the group, the Schaeffler Group, is owned by a family called Schaeffler, surprisingly. And they have a holdco which is called IHO, and that has just placed today new bonds which are structurally subordinated to Schaeffler's liabilities and Continental liabilities. So it happens in reality. It's not just theory. And obviously the coupon is higher than the coupon of the Schaeffler facilities. That's the structure. And now we lawyers like to talk about agreements. Let's talk about agreements. The term investor agreements is a bit misleading. Why? Well, you'll see. Because it's all kind of agreements which any form of investor in our structure may enter into. What investors do we have? Well, we have our shareholders. We may have management as additional shareholders. We have our lenders. There may be mezzanine lenders. There may only be senior lenders. And looking at these different stakeholders, they all have their own agreements. The equity typically has, of course, the company has articles of incorporation. I mean, our Acrico will have articles of incorporation, and we may in addition have a shareholders agreement. Why? Look, we discussed about management being incentivized, having skin in the game, by participating in the shareholding of Acrico to align interests. If you have two different shareholder groups, you normally also have some form of a shareholders agreement to ensure that, if management doesn't perform and is kicked out, the funds have a way of obtaining the equity in Acrico. Or if they want to sell, and they want to sell to someone else, they need to be able to ensure that management sells alongside them, right? Otherwise they couldn't sell someone 100% of the shares in Acrico. So for an exit, it's very important. In a typical buyout, the sponsor and the management have to pool their interests as shareholders. That's what we mean by that. The articles of incorporation are the real articles of association, which you know from a company. But many important provisions, like drag-along rights, tag-along rights, are not in the articles of incorporation, but in a separate shareholders agreement, which does not have to be handed into the register, which is not publicly available. That can be kept secret, basically. Yes?
If there is a conflict between the two, which sometimes happens, like, does it like rank one over the other? Is articles above the shareholders, or?
Well, the articles of association govern the relationship. If the shareholder agreement says something different, that shareholder agreement only works between the parties. Whereas the articles of association work towards the entire outside world, not only the shareholders. So, to the extent the rules in the articles of association and in the shareholders agreement contradict themselves, the two shareholders will usually say the provisions of the shareholder agreement prevail, but to the extent those would conflict with law, they can't override statutory law, and to the extent they contradict the articles of incorporation and they have an impact on the outside world, so you and me and any third party, they obviously can't override what is set out in the articles of incorporation, because that's what governs the relationship between the company and the entire outside world. So the shareholders agreement is only an inter se agreement between the two shareholders. It doesn't impact the relationship between the shareholder and the company, and it doesn't impact the relationship between the company and the outside world. Clear?
Yeah.
We've seen that our shareholders may not only provide equity, they may provide shareholder loans. So you will have to look at shareholder loan agreements. The relationship of lenders with investor agreements. Shareholders' rights in relation to Aquico and the target, if there are any, will be strictly subordinated to the lender's claims. So, if we have a shareholder loan in place, financial shareholders' rights, so shareholder loan, the shareholders will have to subordinate these to lenders' claims, either in a subordination agreement or in an intercreditor agreement. Sometimes, but you can forget about that, it's just technicality. Subordination can be done in a way in which the beneficiary of the subordination is not a party to the agreement. So, in our world, the shareholder providing a loan to its company, and the company can agree on a subordination for the benefit of the banks, without the banks being party. In England, this is called third-party right. For us, it's a third-party benefit arrangement. Works in a very similar manner. So the banks don't necessarily have to be party. They usually want to be a party to ensure that things aren't changed, although there are methods of preventing a change to the detriment of the third-party beneficiary. Mezzanine lenders may have what we call an equity kicker, an option to acquire shares at a low price in order to benefit from the increase in value. This is just, to round up the picture. It's nothing which we expect you to memorize. These are basically the types of agreements that you will look at. When you diligence a company, when you structure a financing, you will look at the articles of incorporation, you will look at existing shareholder agreements, you will look at shareholder loan agreements, and you will look at subordination and or intercreditor agreements. And if there is an equity kicker agreement for mezzanine as an option agreement, basically, you may also look at that. That was it so far for the investor agreements. We'll get to subordination and intercreditor agreements in a bit more detail, because actually we want you to understand how the banks demand a subordination to be made, such that what was supposed to be equity, remember the shadow loan is supposed to replace equity, to ensure that this actually works as an equity. Public to private transactions. Does anybody know what that is?
Private transactions in a GmbH or public in a AG, like a public company, a stock corporation?
Close to being right. This is an acquisition of a public entity in order to take it private afterwards. So you're acquiring a stock corporation basically to convert it into a limited liability company afterwards. And why are we mentioning these? Well, because there are structuring issues which come in addition to the usual structuring issues when you finance the acquisition of shares in a listed company. The reason is, you've seen in our structure here when we discussed assuming acquisition debt by way of a debt push down, I said we can only do that in certain limits, and the limits are usually set by the statutory capital and capital maintenance rules. It's also true for a stock corporation, but there we have additional boundaries, which are a stock corporation, at least under German law, can only distribute to its shareholder not capital and not retained earnings, well, it can retain earnings, but only retained earnings. It can't distribute capital reserves. It can basically only distribute the annual profit it has derived during the last financial year. That's one. And the second is, we haven't mentioned financial assistance limitations so far, because for German limited liability companies, most of the targets in private equity transaction will not be listed companies, but privately held companies. When you try to acquire a listed company, you also have limitations on financial assistance. Financial assistance being any form of assistance of the target in financing the acquisition of the shares in the company. Listed companies cannot, often they basically cannot make existing cash available for the acquisition. They can't upstream cash to its shareholder, except to the extent it's distributable balance sheet profit. And they can't assume debt. And they can't, and that's even more important, they can't provide collateral. Our financial assistance rules for a stock corporation prevent us from using two ways of overcoming structural subordination. They prevent us from providing collateral and guarantees, and they basically also prevent us from doing a debt pushdown. With one exception, and that's the debt pushdown to the extent Acrico repays a listed company's indebtedness. What will the banks say? Hey, great, that's something I want to acquire. That's something I want to invest in by providing debt. No, of course not, because they can't overcome the structural subordination. So what do?
Take it private.
You take it private and try to deal with guaranteeing and collateralizing afterwards. That's what happens. You try to delist and convert the listed company into a private company post-acquisition, and then the banks have already demanded in the facility agreement that as soon as it has been taken private, the target companies need to accede to the facility agreement, provide guarantees, provide collateral, and to the extent possible also through a debt pushdown. Forget about this. It's just one more picture to describe that it's difficult. That's what the line, the dotted line, describes, that you basically can't do much. You can only provide senior debt to the listed stock corporation to the extent it needs to refinance existing indebtedness.
Yeah.
That's all. The rest is pretty much the same as this picture. Any questions so far? Then let's start with my favorite topic, and that's documentation of debt financing. We don't dive into the facility agreement immediately, although you already have it. We start with something else. How does a transaction evolve over time when a private equity sponsor wants to purchase a company? Do you have an idea how those transactions work these days? Has anybody ever participated in a private equity transaction?
Partly.
Partly? How did that go?
I mean, I was part of a transaction where private equity was a shareholder, but it was a later transaction, but not in the beginning. So
Let me tell you how it works in the beginning. I very often work for a Dutch private equity sponsor, and they look at all sorts of potential targets. They try to obtain as much information first publicly available, and then they talk to potential sellers. And what happens very often is that there's an interesting target on the market, and a seller of such a target, the current shareholder, what will the current shareholder do? Will they talk to my client and say, hey, it would be great if we two did a deal? Is that the way it works? That's right. Is right. And is because that doesn't maximize value. How do you maximize value? You create, what's the word? I've heard it. Who was it? You create competition. Yeah. Create competition. Yeah. That increases the value. So you draw up a nice pitch book, a nice presentation about the company that you might be selling, and you distribute that to not only my client, you distribute it to the entire world, basically. the entire private equity universe. Now, very often those presentations go out to hundreds of potential investors. They all need to sign confidentiality agreements up front and so on. But it goes to many people. And then many private equity investors look at one and the same target. And then they start to make up their minds whether they're really interested. And when they're really interested, they remember, I've heard something about this thing called leverage effect. What do I need to do if I want to buy a company? I need to do my capital call in time, yeah, of course. But I also want to leverage my transaction, right? So what I need to do, I need to find banks. I need to find banks that want to finance my acquisition. And what do banks need to do? Do they simply write a check and say, hey, great, here it is? No. Very good. Due diligence. Why? They will do due diligence, and they will do that for one very important reason, which we've mentioned many times before, and I will not become tired to reiterate that. Because the lenders only lend against the cash flows and the assets of the target, the non-recourse phenomenon. That's why the lenders will thoroughly due diligence the potential company they will be financing. How do they due diligence? Well, they very often rely on something which the private equity investor does itself for protecting its own equity, because the private equity investors will also conduct due diligence, right? They will conduct due diligence by commissioning lawyers, tax advisors, financial advisors, and often others like environmental, real estate, to thoroughly vet the target company. And what happens when they receive the reports from their due diligence providers, they will pass these on to the banks and say, look, this is what we've done, look at this yourself. You don't have to do additional due diligence by commissioning other people, but here's our reports, and you can read them, and thereby you will also be doing your due diligence. Is that a great idea from the bank's perspective?
No.
Depends. Depends. When is it a great idea? If the bank can really rely on the due diligence report and can hold provider liable in case the provider has missed something. So it's a question of being able to rely on due diligence. But going back to when we started, we talk to our banks. And what do we want from our banks? Do we want a facility agreement? In the end, we want a facility agreement. But how does the process of such a, we call the process of the acquisition or the selling of the company, which is done by way of competition, we call it an auction. Because it's run like an auction. People start bidding prices on that particular company. So in an auction, the auction often comes in different stages. In a preliminary stage where we approach like 100 potential investors, and then the seller narrows it down one by one, essentially over time, to maybe a group of 10 or 12 in one stage, and then later on, when they really want to make up their mind whom to sell to, and to basically start negotiating a sale and purchase agreement, they may only do that with 2 or 3. So, what do I want to know as a seller when I'm talking to my potential purchasers?
You should have the money.
They should have the money. And how do I show to the potential seller that I have the money?
That have acquired financing, a commitment letter from the banks.
They may provide a commitment letter by the banks. Do they do that with the potential 100 purchasers which they approach initially?
No.
Do they tell every 100, all the 100, please come to us and provide a fully committed financing from the banks? No, and they don't do that for 2 reasons. A, it's unrealistic, and B, the banks only provide commitment letters, hard commitment letters, against the payment of a fee, and no sponsor who's interested in looking at a company would at this stage pay the banks with a chance of 1 to 100 of being successful in the auction. That's why in the initial stages, we don't get a commitment letter, but something which we haven't mentioned there for a reason, and that's called a highly confident letter, sometimes also referred to as a love letter. Why is it called a love letter? Because the banks in that letter say, we understand our client, the private equity sponsor ABC, is interested in acquiring company D. And we love the deal. And we're interested and highly confident that we can participate and provide financing. By the way, this is not a legally binding commitment, and we disclaim anything. It's called love letter because we love the deal, and it's called highly confident because the banks say that they are confident that they will be able to provide financing. That's the first stage. And we'll get to the commitment letter next week. Okay? Thanks for listening. Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah?
And ask now or after class.
However you like. Of interest for the entire class?
This is better we finish our class.
Okay, very good. Because we're already over time.
Provider.